Lonely rancher hadn't touched a woman in 15 years, until a beautiful mail-order bride arrived by mistake. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The prairie sun burned low over the horizon, spilling orange fire across the endless plains. The cattle had already been driven back into their enclosures, and a dry wind whispered through the mesquite. Out there, alone on his land, a tall figure leaned on the weathered corral rail. The only companion to his silence was the cry of a hawk circling above. Ethan McGraw. At 42, he was a man carved out of solitude and the dust of the earth. His hands were calloused like leather, his shoulders broad as a barn door, and his eyes, the color of storm clouds, held stories no one dared to ask about. The townfolk knew better than to prod too deep. Everyone in Red Rock, a small frontier settlement clinging to survival, whispered about Ethan. That's the man who buried his wife and never looked at another woman again. It had been 15 long years since death stole Mary, the only woman he had ever loved, and the baby she had carried. Ethan hadn't allowed himself another touch, another whisper of tenderness. To him, women were ghosts of a life he had lost. His bed was cold, his home colder still. Most nights, he sat alone in his ranch house with nothing but the tick of the grandfather clock and the groan of the old timbers keeping him company. The house had once smelled of cornbread and roses, once filled with laughter and the lullabies of a hopeful mother. Now it smelled of dust and wood smoke, attuned to what once was. Ethan wasn't bitter, just empty. His life had narrowed to 3 things: cattle, land, and weather. Those were the only truths that did not betray. On this evening, he was preparing to ride into town for supplies. He strapped his old saddle onto his horse, Dusty, a loyal gelding that had carried him through drought, blizzards, and endless days of work. With one last look over the spread of his land, miles of golden grass rolling beneath the dying sun, he rode toward Red Rock, his long shadow stretching over the earth. The town was alive in its own way. Children darted between storefronts, cowboys leaned against posts sharing stories louder than their whiskey, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from Mrs. Callahan's bakery. But when Ethan rode in, voices hushed just slightly. He didn't notice, he never did, but the folks watched him. The widows eyed him with both pity and longing, whispering, "Such a strong man to waste away alone." The younger women giggled behind lace-gloved hands, yet none dared approach. Ethan gave no invitation, and his expression, set in stone, kept everyone at a polite distance. He dismounted outside the general store, nodding curtly to Mr. Hensley, the shopkeeper. "Evenin', Ethan," Hensley greeted. "Gotten some fresh flour and salt pork for you. Heard the weather's turnin' bad next week." "Reckon I'll be ready," Ethan replied, voice low, steady as gravel shifting under boots. As Hensley packed his supplies, Ethan felt the usual tug of loneliness creep up on him, but he shoved it down with the discipline of years. This was life. This was how it had to be. He had chosen to bury his heart alongside Mary. But fate, as the plains often remind a man, never asks permission. The sharp whistle of a stagecoach horn cut through the air. All heads turned as the Red Rock stage rolled in, wheels rattling and horses foaming from the long journey. The coach stopped outside the depot, dust swirling around it like a curtain. Ethan leaned slightly on the post, uninterested at first. He'd seen countless travelers come and go. But then, the door swung open, and a figure stepped down, her gloved hand delicate against the driver's arm. She was a woman. Not just any woman, but one who seemed too fine for this wild land. Clara Bennett, though he did not yet know her name, lifted her chin and looked around the dusty town with eyes wide as the sky. Her dress, though travel-worn, was neatly pressed. Her face, framed by chestnut curls, held both determination and weariness. She clutched a small valise to her chest, as though it carried her last hope. The townsfolk whispered, as townsfolk always do. "Another mail-order bride? She don't look like the kind we usually get out here. Wonder which fella she belongs to." Ethan didn't join the chatter. He meant to turn back to his supplies and his horse, to ignore her the way he ignored all else that didn't belong to his narrow world. But then his storm-colored eyes caught hers, and for the briefest of moments, the loneliness inside him stirred. Clara blinked, as though startled by the hardness in his gaze. She quickly looked away, moving toward the depot with a sense of purpose. But Ethan stood rooted, his chest tight, as though some invisible thread had just tied itself between them. He shook it off. She wasn't his concern. She wasn't anyone's concern, not until the mistake of her arrival was revealed. And yet, as the sun dropped behind the horizon and the shadows of night spilled into the town, Ethan McGraw, lonely rancher of Red Rock, had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Because that woman, who stepped off the stagecoach by mistake, would soon be standing inside his cold, empty ranch house, lighting a fire that had been dead for 15 years. The stage depot in Red Rock was a small, weathered building with a swinging sign that creaked whenever the wind blew. The clerk, a thin man named Mr. Dobbs, had already been shuffling papers when Clara Bennett stepped inside, carrying her valise and brushing the dust from her traveling dress. Her heart was pounding. She had traveled nearly 1,000 miles by train and coach, leaving everything behind. Her widowed mother had remarried and moved east. Her sisters married off to men who could provide. Clara had no such luxury. Her only chance at a future lay in the letter she clutched, a promise written in neat, masculine handwriting. I will take you as my wife, and you shall have a home. That promise had given her courage to step into the unknown. But as she looked at Mr. Dobbs, who squinted at her with confusion, Clara's heart faltered. Yes, ma'am, he said, adjusting his spectacles. I'm here to meet my intended husband, she said softly, her voice carrying the faint lilt of New England schooling. Mr. Thomas Whitaker. He sent for me. At the mention of the name, Dobbs froze. His face shifted, awkward and uncertain. Thomas Whitaker, you say? Yes, Clara replied, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. He sent money for my fare. I corresponded with him for months. He said he was ready to wed upon my arrival. The depot clerk cleared his throat, shuffling the ledger in front of him. Miss, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Thomas Whitaker passed away 3 weeks back, caught in a stampede accident, buried out near Cedar Hill. The words struck her like a blow. Her gloved hand tightened on her valise until her knuckles ached. Dead, she whispered. But his letter, he said. I know, Dobbs said, softening. It was an unfortunate mess. The post out here is slow. Guess his last letter reached you before the news did. He removed his spectacles and rubbed them, as if avoiding her eyes. I'm sorry, miss. You've come a long way for nothing. Clara's breath caught. Not for nothing, she wanted to say. This was her last chance at a place in the world. She had no family to turn back to, no money to travel elsewhere. She was a bride without a groom, stranded in a town full of strangers. Behind her, townsfolk had begun to murmur. A few women whispered in pity, others with disdain. Mail-order brides weren't rare, but one arriving for a dead man was another matter entirely. Clara straightened her back, forcing the tears to stay in her eyes and not fall. She would not be pitied. I'll find work, she said firmly, more to herself than anyone else. I am capable. Dobbs frowned. Work scarce, miss. Not many take kindly to a lady living alone. You'd best think carefully where you'll go. It was then that Ethan McGraw, who had been lingering near the counter, paying for his sack of flour and salt pork, turned his head. His storm-gray eyes rested on Clara. He'd heard the exchange, though he pretended not to be listening. Clara met his gaze again, just for a moment, and something inside her chest tightened. He looked as immovable as a mountain, broad-shouldered, rough-bearded, with lines etched deep into his sun-browned face. But unlike the others, he wasn't staring at her with pity or gossip. His look was unreadable, steady, almost grounding. Still, he turned back, scooping up his supplies as though it was none of his concern. And perhaps it wasn't. Clara stepped outside, the evening air biting her skin. The stagecoach had already rattled away, and she stood alone on the dusty street, holding her valise with both hands. Every direction stretched into wilderness, miles of scrub, canyons, and horizon. Her lips trembled. What have I done? Where do I go now? As if in answer, a voice came from behind her. Low, gravelly, steady. You got any people to take you in? Clara turned. It was Ethan, standing tall, his hat pulled low. The last rays of sun burned behind him, casting him in silhouette like some carved figure of the frontier itself. She shook her head. No, no one. Ethan studied her, his jaw tightening. A part of him screamed to walk away, to let this woman find her own way, just as he had done for 15 years. But another part, long buried, restless, would not let him. You can't stay out here in the street, he said after a pause. Town ain't fit for a woman alone. Folks talk, and worse. Clara swallowed hard. What are you suggesting? Ethan hesitated, as though the words pained him. I've got room at the ranch. It ain't much, and I ain't promising more than a roof. But it's safe. You can stay until you figure what's next. The offer startled her. He didn't sound like a man used to giving charity. His tone was gruff, almost reluctant. Clara, with her pride still intact, drew herself up. You don't even know me. No, Ethan admitted. His eyes softened just slightly. But I know what it feels like to be left standing with no place to go. Something in his voice, a shadow of grief, pierced through Clara's fear. She lowered her gaze, her valise heavy in her arms. After a long silence, she nodded. Then, I accept. And with that, the lonely rancher who had vowed never to let another woman into his home found himself riding back into the fading twilight, beside a beautiful stranger who had arrived in his life by mistake. Neither of them knew it yet, but the mistake would change them both forever. The ride back to the McGraw Ranch was a long one. The sun had slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of indigo and crimson. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the steady clop of Ethan's horse, Dusty, was the only sound for miles. Clara sat side-saddle on Ethan's spare mare, holding her valise against her lap. Though her posture was straight, her fingers trembled slightly on the reins. She was trying her best to look composed, but the day's shock weighed heavy on her. Every now and then, she dared to glance at the man riding beside her. He was silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his shoulders set like stone. His presence was commanding, but it wasn't unkind. He hadn't asked her questions, where she came from, what she planned to do, why she had no one to return to. He seemed the type of man who spoke only when necessary. Still, the silence between them stretched thick. Clara, unused to such stillness, finally tried to fill it. Do you live alone, Mr. McGraw? She asked softly. Ethan didn't look her way. Yes. For how long? 15 years. The answer was blunt, final, and heavy with meaning Clara didn't dare press into. She lowered her gaze to her mare's mane and let the silence settle again. By the time they reached the ranch, the moon was high. Ethan dismounted, tying Dusty to the hitching post, then helped Clara down from the saddle. His hands were strong, calloused, but careful when they brushed hers. For a fleeting second, Clara felt a warmth travel through her, a reminder that it had been years since anyone had touched her in kindness. Ethan led her toward the house. The ranch was modest but well kept. A barn to the side, corrals stretching beyond, and the main house standing plain and tall against the night. When he opened the door and struck a match to the lantern inside, Clara's breath caught. The interior was lifeless. The wooden floorboards creaked, dust clung to the corners, and though the space was large, it felt suffocatingly empty. Curtains hung stiff and faded. A heavy silence pressed down like a weight. It was not a home. It was a house, preserved like a shell after something living had long since gone. You could take the room upstairs, second door on the right, Ethan said, setting the lantern on the table. His voice was gruff, as though he were already regretting his decision to bring her here. Clara set her valise down and looked around. She could almost hear echoes of laughter that once filled these walls, of footsteps running down the stairs, of a woman humming over a stove. She recognized it instantly. This house had once been alive with family. Now it was a mausoleum of memory. Thank you, she whispered, her voice catching. Ethan nodded curtly. I'll be up early. If you need anything, ask. He hesitated, then added, Don't feel obliged to stay long. Just until you figure things out. Clara nodded, though deep down she wondered, where else could she possibly go? That first night, she lay awake in the narrow bed of the upstairs room, staring at the ceiling. The sheets smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The house groaned with the shifting of the wind outside. She felt the weight of her new reality pressing on her chest. A stranger's roof over her head. No future promised. No husband to claim her. Yet, she also remembered the way Ethan had looked at her in town. Not with hunger. Not with pity. Just steadiness. And in that, she found the smallest measure of comfort. The following morning, Clara rose early. She found the kitchen cold, the fireplace ashes untouched. Ethan was already outside, working the cattle, his broad frame visible through the window. The man had started his day long before dawn. Clara looked around the kitchen, bare shelves, unwashed pans, a stale loaf of bread. It was a place abandoned to function rather than care. With a quiet determination, she rolled up her sleeves. She swept the floor, scrubbed the counters, and found the courage to spark the stove back to life. The smell of coffee began to fill the air, mingling with frying bacon she had salvaged from the pantry. When Ethan stepped inside a while later, sweat glistening on his brow from the morning's labor, he froze. His storm-gray eyes flicked to the stove, the table, the woman standing there in his kitchen as though she belonged. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Clara turned, a gentle smile softening her face. "What does it look like, Mr. McGraw?" "I'm making breakfast. A home shouldn't smell like dust. It should smell like life." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his chest he didn't want to name. He cleared his throat and pulled off his gloves. "I told you, you don't owe me nothing. And you don't owe me either," Clara replied calmly, placing a plate on the table. "But perhaps we both could use a little kindness." For the first time in 15 years, Ethan McGraw sat down at his kitchen table and ate a meal prepared by a woman. The clinking of forks, the warmth of coffee, and the soft hum Clara let slip as she worked filled the silence that had haunted his house for too long. Ethan kept his eyes on his plate, but inside, the walls of his heart trembled. The summer air that day was heavy, the kind that clung to the skin and made the horses restless in their pens. Clara had been at the ranch for nearly a week now, and already the house felt different. Curtains had been drawn back to let in the light. Fresh bread rested on the counter instead of stale biscuits, and a vase of wildflowers she'd gathered from the creek brightened the table. Ethan noticed, though he said nothing. Each small change tugged at the edges of his silence. That evening, as Clara hung laundry on the line, Ethan was checking the sky. Dark clouds were rolling fast over the plains, swallowing the sun. The air crackled with the scent of rain and something fiercer. He frowned, tightening the strap on his saddle. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "Could be bad." Clara looked up from the linens. "Do you need help?" He almost told her no, that it was men's work, that she should stay inside. But when he met her gaze, steady and unafraid, he gave a short nod. "I'll be driving the herd closer to the barn. Lightning spooks cattle. They'll scatter if I don't get impenned." Without waiting, Clara snatched up her shawl and followed. By the time they reached the fields, the storm had broken. Rain poured in sheets, soaking through their clothes. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning lit up the vast horizon, flashing white across the frightened herd. Ethan was in the thick of it, shouting commands, swinging his rope, urging the cattle toward the fence line. His horse, Dusty, pounded the wet ground, mud flying with every kick. Clara, clutching the reins of her borrowed mare, fought the wind and rain to keep up. "Stay back," Ethan shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. But Clara saw a calf trapped in the mire near the creek bed, bleeding in panic as the water swelled around it. Without thinking, she urged her horse forward, sliding down into the mud. Her skirts clung heavy, her boots sinking, but she pressed on, gripping the calf's slick hide and pulling with all her strength. "Clara!" Ethan's voice boomed across the storm. She gritted her teeth and shoved until the calf stumbled free, scrambling to its feet and bolting back toward the herd. Clara, panting and drenched, nearly fell to her knees. Then Ethan was there, dismounting in a flash, his strong hands gripping her shoulders. His eyes blazed, not with anger, but with fear. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded, rain dripping from his hat brim, his voice raw. "You could have been swept away." Clara met his glare, chest heaving. "And you could have lost that calf. Your herd matters, doesn't it?" "I won't stand by useless." For a long, tense moment, they stared at one another, lightning cracking the sky behind them. Then Ethan's grip softened. He had seen plenty of women break out here, too fragile for the land, too frightened of the work. But Clara had grit. She'd stepped into the storm without hesitation. Something inside him shifted, something he'd long buried beneath 15 years of grief. By the time they herded the cattle into safety, the storm had blown east. The two of them stumbled into the house, soaked to the bone, leaving trails of water across the floorboards. Clara was laughing breathlessly, her cheeks flushed from the rain, while Ethan shook his head, pulling off his sodden coat. "Never seen anyone so stubborn," he muttered, though the corner of his mouth twitched with something dangerously close to a smile. Clara wrung out her shawl, her eyes sparkling despite the exhaustion. "Then maybe you've never seen a woman who refuses to be tossed aside." Her words lingered in the air between them. They sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets as the storm's distant rumble faded into the night. The flickering glow painted Clara's face in warm light, and Ethan found himself watching her more than he should, watching the way her damp curls framed her cheeks, the way her eyes softened as she looked into the flames. His hand twitched, aching to reach across the small space that separated them. For 15 years, he had not allowed himself to feel this. Longing, hunger, hope. It burned inside him like the fire crackling in the hearth. But when Clara shifted, her blanket slipping slightly from her shoulder, Ethan stood abruptly. "I'll see to the barn," he said, his voice rough, as though fighting himself. Clara looked up at him, eyes searching, but she said nothing. She simply pulled the blanket closer and watched as the lonely rancher walked out into the night, carrying the weight of a heart that no storm could wash clean. Yet for the first time in years, the house did not feel so empty. The morning after the storm, Red Rock was buzzing with chatter. The heavy rains had flooded the creek, uprooted a few fences, and scattered livestock across the valley. But none of that stirred the town near as much as the news carried in by Mrs. Callahan, who ran the bakery. "Mark my words," she told anyone who'd listen, "that Bennett girl is staying at Ethan McGraw's ranch, under his roof, alone." By midday, the whispers were everywhere. Women shook their heads in disapproval, men raised their brows in curiosity, and children repeated what they heard at home. In a town as small as Red Rock, gossip traveled faster than wildfire across dry grass. Clara wasn't blind to it. She felt the stares when she walked down the boardwalk with her shawl wrapped tight, carrying a basket of supplies. The butcher's wife refused to meet her eye. The seamstress smiled too sweetly, her words coated in judgment. Clara held her chin high. She had endured long days of loneliness back east, endured the humiliation of being the leftover sister, the one no man had chosen. These whispers would not break her. Still, they stung. When she stepped out of the mercantile, basket in hand, she heard two women murmuring near the post. "Shameless, if you ask me. Living with a man, not even married. What kind of woman does that?" Clara's steps faltered, but she pressed on, refusing to let them see the hurt. Ethan was tying up his horse outside the blacksmith's when he spotted her. He'd come into town for nails and feed, but the moment he caught sight of Clara walking with her basket, her face pale and proud, he knew. He could read her room without needing to hear words. The town was talking. His jaw tightened. He wasn't a man given to defending himself. He didn't care what people thought of him. But Clara, she wasn't built for cruel tongues. She had come here on nothing but courage, and these people were cutting her down. He crossed the street with long strides, his boots echoing against the boards. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying that steady weight she'd come to recognize. She looked up, startled, then gave a small smile. "Mr. McGraw, finish your errands?" "Yes," she replied softly, adjusting her shawl. Her eyes flicked to the women still whispering behind them, and color rushed to her cheeks. Ethan noticed. His storm-gray eyes hardened. He turned slowly, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the boardwalk as he faced the gossipers. "You got something to say about the woman under my roof?" His voice was low but carried across the street like a rumble of thunder. The two women paled, their words dying in their throats. One stammered, "No, Mr. McGraw, we were just—" "Then keep it that way," he cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through their whispers. "She came here honest, and she deserves respect. You'll show it, or you'll answer to me." The women lowered their eyes, murmuring apologies before scurrying off. Clara stood frozen, her heart thudding in her chest. Ethan turned back to her, his expression softer now. "You done here?" She nodded, unable to find her voice. "Then let's head back." On the ride home, the silence between them wasn't heavy like before. It was charged, humming with something new. Clara glanced at him from her mare, studying the rigid line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied. Clara's breath caught. His words were simple, but they carried more weight than any she'd heard in a long time. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, fighting back the warmth rising in her chest. That evening, back at the ranch, Clara stood by the window, watching the sun dip low over the plains. Ethan was outside, repairing a fence post the storm had knocked down. His silhouette was strong against the fading light, every movement purposeful. She thought of the way he had stood up for her in town, his voice unyielding, his presence commanding the silence of every gossiping tongue. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt something bloom inside her, not just gratitude but safety, and perhaps something more. The days after Ethan's defense of her in town settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara tended the house, kneading bread in the mornings and sewing by the window in the afternoons. Ethan worked the land, his broad figure moving steadily across the fields. They spoke little, but each word carried more weight than the silence. Every glance lingered a fraction longer. Every brush of fingers when passing a plate sent a ripple neither dared name. Still, there was a wall between them, one built of grief and years of silence. One evening, the air was warm with the scent of sage and the hum of crickets. Clara was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of stew. The sound carried into the main room, where Ethan sat sharpening a blade, his hand steady but his mind restless. Her voice was low, sweet, unpolished. It filled the house in a way that felt dangerous to him. It reminded him of another woman's voice, 15 years gone. He set the blade down with a sharp clang. Clara turned, startled. "Did I disturb you?" she asked gently. Ethan stood, pacing a step as though wrestling with something inside. "Why are you here, Clara?" She blinked. "You know why. I came as a bride. But my groom," her voice caught. "He was gone before I arrived." Ethan's gaze darkened. "And yet you stay. You cook. You clean. You hum songs in my kitchen as if you belong here." Clara's hands tightened on the spoon. "Would you rather I left?" The question hung between them like a blade. Ethan's chest rose and fell, his jaw working. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice rough, stripped bare. "I ain't touched a woman in 15 years. Clara's lips parted, her breath caught. He had never spoken so plainly, so raw. Ethan's eyes burned, fixed on hers. "My wife, Mary, she died bringing my child into this world. Lost them both that night. And I swore I'd never put my hands on another woman again. Not after that. Not after burying the only good thing I ever had." His voice cracked, low and ragged. "So I shut myself off, built these walls, let the years turn me into stone. Safer that way. No one to lose, no one to mourn." Clara stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes, not from pity but from the sheer weight of his pain. "Ethan," she whispered, stepping closer. He shook his head, turning away as if ashamed. "But then you walked off that stagecoach, uninvited, unplanned, and suddenly my house is warm again. And I don't know if it's mercy or punishment that I can't stop hearing your voice in my head when I'm out in the fields." Clara reached for him then, her hand trembling but sure as she laid it against his arm. He stiffened under her touch, every muscle tense as though he might pull away. But he didn't. "You think love is something you buried," Claire said softly. "But it isn't dead, Ethan. It's here." She pressed her hand gently over his chest, still beating whether you admit it or not. His storm-gray eyes met hers, searching, torn between fear and longing. Slowly, as though surrendering to something greater than himself, Ethan lowered his forehead to hers. His breath was ragged, his voice a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this again." "You don't have to know," Clara murmured. "Just let yourself feel." And in that fragile moment, after 15 years of silence, Ethan McGraw finally bent his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger, but of release, of a dam breaking, of a man finally letting himself reach for what he thought he had lost forever. Clara's hands clutched his shirt, her heart racing. His arms, strong and steady, wrapped around her as though he had been starving for this touch. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan's eyes glistened in the firelight. He had no words, only the truth shining in the way he looked at her. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The weeks after their first kiss were different. Subtle, but undeniable. Ethan still rose before dawn, his boots crunching across the frosted earth. But now Clara was always awake before him, setting coffee on the stove, humming softly as she handed him a steaming mug. He still worked the ranch with quiet grit, but there was a lightness in his step, a flicker in his eyes that hadn't been there for years. The townsfolk noticed too. When Ethan McGraw rode into town with Clara at his side, shoulders straight and head high, whispers followed. But this time, he didn't lower his gaze. He placed his hand firmly at the small of Clara's back, letting the world know she was under his protection, his and no one else's. At the general store, Mrs. Harper, who once clucked her tongue at Clara's presence on the ranch, softened. "Well," she said, eyeing Ethan as he paid for flour and sugar, "looks like that old house of yours has found its heartbeat again." Ethan only gave a small smile, the corner of his mouth tugging as his gaze shifted to Clara. "Yes, ma'am, it surely has." One evening, the two of them sat out on the porch. The prairie stretched wide, painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Clara had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair loose and stirring in the breeze. Ethan rocked slowly in the chair beside her, a quiet peace filling the air between them. "Strange, isn't it?" Clara said softly, her voice carrying into the stillness. "How a mistake could bring me here." Ethan turned to her, his jaw working as he considered his words. "I've been thinking on that. A mistake, maybe, but I reckon it was the good Lord's way of setting me straight. I never put in for a mail-order bride, but you came just the same." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering in the fading light. "And you let me stay." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "At first, I thought it'd be temporary. Thought I'd keep my heart locked up like I had all those years. But Clara," he paused, his voice thickening, "you've torn down every wall I built. You've brought laughter back to this house, warmth back to my soul." Clara's breath caught, her chest rising as she searched his face. Ethan stood then, his boots scraping against the wood of the porch. He moved before her, broad shoulders outlined by the fading sunset. Slowly, almost reverently, he knelt down on one knee. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Clara Bennett," Ethan said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "You weren't meant for me by paper or promise. You were meant for me by something far greater. I don't want you as a guest in my house. I want you as my wife, the woman I'll stand beside for the rest of my days." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Oh, Ethan." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver band, his late wife's ring, polished and shining again. He held it out, not with sadness, but with hope. "Will you let me love you proper, Clara? Will you marry me?" Her answer came not in words at first, but in the way she threw her arms around his neck, pressing her forehead against his. Her voice broke with joy. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands firm yet tender. She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no ghost between them. only the promise of a new life, a new beginning. The story closed with the two of them standing hand in hand, gazing out over the wide prairie as night fell. The stars lit the heavens like lanterns, and the ranch no longer felt like a place of sorrow, but a home reborn. Clara whispered against his shoulder, "Maybe I was never lost. Maybe I was led here to where I was always meant to be." And Ethan McGraw, a man who thought he'd buried his heart forever, finally smiled without pain. A bride meant to be.